Hey everybody, this video is called Hello Eliza, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of 1 Kings, just looking at the 17th chapter at a very popular passage. When people go through 1 Kings, they love hearing about Elijah. And so we're going to look at the early ministry today of Elijah. And just wanted to point out at this point, we are 3/4 of the way through this study right here. But chapter 17, verse 1, it says, "And Elijah, the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead, said to Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word." And so Elijah means the Lord is God, and his ministry corresponded to his name, as we're going to see. And he was sent by God to confront the idolatry of Baalism and to declare to Israel that the Lord was God. And he was also to declare that there is no other God but Jehovah. And Elijah, he lived in a town called Tishbe, which was on the eastern side of the Jordan River in the vicinity of the Jabbok River. And the autumn and spring rains and summer dew were necessities for the crops of Israel. And the Lord had threatened to withhold these from the land if his people turned from him to serve the other false gods. And Elijah, he prayed for the drought, and we see that God answers by giving a drought. And as we're going to see from the account of the Apostle James, this drought lasts 3.5 years. In the drought, it proved that Baal, the god of the rains and fertility, was powerless before Jehovah God. In verse 2 through 5, it says, "Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Get away from here and turn eastward and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. And it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord, for he went and stayed by the brook Cherith, which flows from the Jordan. So brook Cherith was probably the seasonal brook that flowed from during the rainy season, but dried up when the weather turned hot. And it was east to the Jordan River. And Elijah was sent there for his own safety, as the drought was a great threat, but as well also to train him on having full dependence on the Lord. And Elijah, he had to have faith that the brook would stop flowing, or would keep flowing by God's power, and to accept the unclean animal ravens for food. And verse 6 here says, "The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook." So God's supernatural provision, much like the manna and the quail during Israel's wilderness wanderings in Exodus chapter 16, verse 13 through 16. And every bit of his food came from the beak of an unclean animal. And it's interesting to think about that God uses an unclean animal rather than a clean animal to provide for him. And if he refused the unclean animal, obviously it would result in his starvation. And Charles Spurgeon, when he preached this passage, made two great points in application, likening the food the ravens brought to spiritual food. And he taught that God may bring a good word to us through an unclean vessel, and spiritually unclean like a raven. And for sure, God can use someone that is, not necessarily holy type person to share his word. I believe that God can use an unbeliever to correct us in our place when we step out of bounds. And second, one can bring spiritual food to others and still be unclean, spiritually unclean themselves. And Elijah, he came to trust more than ever in the miraculous provision of God here. And in verse 7 it says, "And it happened after a while that the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land." And so verse 7 here, we see that Elijah saw the flow of the brook slow down until it dried up. And his source of water at this point was gone. And he could have been very fearful at this point. But this was the drought that Elijah prayed for. And he did not pray for rain to come again, even for his own survival. But he put his trust in the Lord. And he kept the purpose of God first, even when it adversely affected him. In verse 8 and 9 it says, "Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded you a widow there to provide for you." So verses 8 and 9, Elijah was sent to live in Zarephath, which was a town on the Mediterranean coast, approximately 7 miles south of Sidon. And it was a territory that was controlled by Ahab's father-in-law, Ethbaal. And in this way, he showed that the power of God in the very area where the powerless Baal was worshipped, as he provided miraculously for the widow in the famine, as we're going to see in the upcoming verses here. And Zarephath was a Gentile city. And widows, as you may remember or know, they were ill-famed for their poverty back in the ancient world. To be a widow was to be an extreme curse on someone. And God told Elijah to go to the Gentile woman and receive provision. And you might think this is a kind of foolish. Why would God use someone who's very poor and struggling? Why would God tell his servant to go see this woman? And we're going to see in the upcoming verses here. But verses 10 and 11, it says, "So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, indeed a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called out to her and said, Please bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink. And as she was going to get it, he called to her and said, Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. And so the gathering of the sticks for firewood was proof of her being poor. And Elijah asked for, in faith, for a little cup of water and bread. And it's gonna take quite a bit of faith to be able to ask someone. And common sense says, and circumstances told him, that she would not give to him as a Jewish stranger generously. But by faith, Elijah asked. And we see here that God chose this woman for more than a miracle. We're going to see further God's purpose behind this. He chose her for service. In verse 12, it says, So she said, As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin, and a little oil in a jar, and see, I am gathering a couple of sticks, that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. So we see that she respected the God of Israel in the sense of recognizing the God of Israel as Elijah's God, but nothing further or nothing on her own. And Elijah learns that she is desperately poor. She isn't just poor, she is desperately poor. In verse 13 and 14, and Elijah said to her, Do not fear, go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and for your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth. So God's first word to this widow through Elijah was do not fear. And we see it so often when God speaks to mankind, he tells them to do not fear in the scriptures here. And of course, her crisis caused fear. just because we would also be fearful if we were in her shoes at this period of time. But God wanted to put away her fear, and God wanted her to put trust in him. And we see what seems like a crazy bold request from the prophet Elijah. He asked this widow to give him something from her last bit of food. And to the lost, this may seem like predatory fundraising. This might seem foolish. It would be like me walking up to a homeless person on the street and ask for the shirt off their back or the food that they just got. They may even think of Elijah as a fraud, someone that is bullying someone that's less fortunate. And why could Elijah make this request? Why would he make this request? Because God told him that he would provide a never-ending supply of food for the widow, not just the widow, but her son and Elijah. And Elijah asked the widow to put her trust in this great promise of God that was given. In verse 15-16 it says, "So she went away and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Elijah." So we see that the widow, she takes a great risk of faith here. And she puts her faith in this promise of Elijah's God, that God was going to provide and that God would fulfill his promise to her son, and Elijah. And God used her as a channel of supply, and her needs were met as a result. In verse 17-18, "Now it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, and his sickness was so serious that there was no breath in him. So she said to Elijah, 'What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?'" So just imagine at this point in time, with God providing for her needs as a desperately poor widow, just imagine this is a happy day of provision taking place through the miracle of God. And now her great day has turned into a season of darkness, involving her son, her only son, getting sick and in his death. And her son's death was a double blow, as she would have to suffer as any mother who lost a child. But also, she would have to suffer as one without the loss. She would lose the hope for the expectation to see her son grow and eventually provide for her in her old age. So she would miss all the milestones of her son after he passes here. But not only that, in her old age, she won't have anybody to take care of her. And generally, what is supposed to happen is parents bring their children into this world and they raise their children, and children should be taking care of their parents on their way out of this world. And that expectation for her life at this point in time is shattered. And I feel her personally. I'm not saying that I feel her as a grieving mother, but as a grieving father myself, it is absolutely heartbreaking to have to see your child go on before you. And I grieve often the missed milestones of Aiden, who was 10 when the Lord took him home. And this year is going to be hard too, because in August, Aiden would have been 13. And, we're planning a vacation out to Kentucky to see the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter and all that. And just not seeing him to be able to go into his teenage years, it is heartbreaking. But we see that she blamed Elijah indirectly as well as herself in her unnamed sin. And she felt guilt, whatever her sin was. She had to bring it up. So there had to be guilt in her sin. In verse 19 and 20 it says, "And he said to her, 'Give me your son.' So he took him out of her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying and laid him on his own bed. Then he cried out to the Lord and said, 'O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son?'" And we see this mighty prophet, this wonderful prophet Elijah, is questioning God. He's questioning God after God took her son. And we see the vivid detail that she held onto her dead child tightly in her arms. And as I've mentioned, if you lost a young child, you know exactly that this is not an easy thing. This letting go is not easy. Especially in my case, when your child is on life support and you have to make that decision that you need to pull them off life support because there is no physical thing in our power outside of a working miracle of God. And it is a very hard thing. In the upper room, it was a temporary room that was on the roof, and it was accessible from the outside of the house. And I believe this arrangement gave her privacy and safeguard. And Elijah, we see that he prays with a great heart and intimacy with God. And Elijah, if you get nothing out of Elijah, to study how he prays and, ask the Lord to help you to be a man of prayer or, a lady of prayer like Elijah was. And he brought this unimaginable and unexplainable tragedy to God in prayer. And Elijah put this tragedy into God's hands. Elijah realized, you know what, I'm little man. There is not much I can do. There's not anything this mother can do. Lord, it is all in your hands. Lord, you need to be the one to work in this. In verse 21 through 24, to wrap up the chapter here, it says, "And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord and said, 'O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him.' Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, 'See, your son lives.'" And, he doesn't just tell her, your son lives. It's an exclamation point here. He's like, "See, your son lives. Widow, your son is back." And then the woman said to Elijah, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." So we see a very unusual prayer technique used, and we see that God answered his prayer. And what must be important as we wrap up this chapter right here is we must remember or realize that it is not the techniques we use for God to answer our prayers. God answers prayers in 3 ways to us. God will answer prayer with a yes, he'll say no, or wait. And, it doesn't matter. You can pray on your knees for 10 hours for, that house up on Main Street that you really want, and God can say no. Yet you could pray, just bowing your head, whatever, for the house on Clark Street. And, it could be a 5-minute prayer, and God answers that right away. It is not the amount of time or what you do to have your prayers answered. It is the will of God in your prayers being answered. And it wasn't the technique that raised the boy, but it was the faith of Elijah. Sorry, I said Eliza because that's what we nickname our youngest daughter. And I'm probably going to do that a few more times here, so bear with me and forgive me. But the Canaanite myths claim that Baal could revive the dead. But here, it was the Lord, not Baal, who gave back to this boy's life. We don't see anywhere where the god Baal does a work here. And this conclusively demonstrated that the Lord of Israel was the only true God, and Elijah was his prophet. And in verse 24, a man of God has a true word from God. And raising the dead, it is a very fascinating study. And there's some, Christian circles that's all they ever try to focus on. They want to see miracles of people raising from the dead, so on and so forth. But it is an interesting study throughout the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. And you see it with the Shunammite woman's son, raised by Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 31 through 35. And then we also see at 2 Kings chapter 13, verse 20 through 21, where a man is raised when he came into contact with the bones of Elisha. And we'll be visiting these passages later in about a month or so, or March time frame, Lord willing. And you may think of the popular New Testament passage of Lazarus, Mary's brother and Martha's brother, who Jesus was friends with, and he raised him from the dead in John chapter 11. And we'll look at a few more in our wrap-up, just a little bit ahead from here. But to wrap up our study today, we looked at Elijah told of the Lord's judgment, and we see that Elijah prayed for the drought, and it happened. In James chapter 5, verse 17 and 18, it says here, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and if it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And then he prayed again, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. So, as I mentioned, the drought lasted for 3.5 years, according to James. And it proved that Baal, the god of the rains, was powerless, and fertility, the god of fertility, was powerless before the Lord God Almighty Jehovah. And we might be amazed of Elijah, but we must remember that Elijah was another man, just like us. Elijah had the nature that we have. And we saw Elijah escape to Cherith, and we saw that Elijah's provision in the dry brook. And we see that God called Elijah to Zarephath, where a widow would provide for him. And I want to look at Luke chapter 4. We're going to look at a few passages in the Gospel according to Luke and the book of Acts. So Luke chapter 4, and I believe it's verse 25 I want here. Let me just confirm. Verse 24. It says, Then he said, Assuredly I say to you, no prophet is accepted in his own country. But I tell you, truly, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a great famine throughout all the land. But to none of them was Elijah sent, except to Zarephath in the region of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And so Jesus, he uses this example of Elijah's coming to the widow of Zarephath as an illustration of God's right to choose a people unto himself. And we see that Elijah addressed the widow. We see that she responds in Elijah's words we saw to her. And we saw the widow's obedience and the great blessing that came upon her and her son from God. And we see the widow's son died, and we know that death, especially of a child, it brings extreme grief. And we see Elijah, he prays in faith. He prays hard that God would work a miracle. And God indeed works the miracle we see in the text as he raises the widow's son from the dead. And, Elijah and God, they did not have to use CPR or AED. That stuff wasn't practiced at this time period. But, the power of God is what brought him back from the dead. And Elijah prayed, and God granted a miracle, as mentioned. And we see many similar miracles take place across the New Testament of the Bible. And I want to look at one of the passages, Luke chapter 7, verse 14. This says here, "Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still, and he said, 'Young man, I say to you, arise.' So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother." So we see that Jesus raised the widows of Nain's son in these verses. In Luke chapter 8, verse 52 through 56, it says, "Now all wept and mourned for her, but he said, 'Do not weep. She is not dead, but sleeping.' And they ridiculed him, knowing that she was dead. But he put them all outside, took her by the hand, and called, saying, 'Little girl, arise.' Then her spirit returned, and she arose immediately. And he commanded that she be given something to eat. And her parents were astonished, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened." And so we see that Jesus raised Jairus' daughter. And in the book of Acts, chapter 9, and I believe it's verse 20 I want here. Verse 40, sorry. So, Acts 9:40, "But Peter put them all out, and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, 'Tabitha, arise.' And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up." So we see that the Apostle Peter raised Dorcas. And we saw the miracles of Jesus. His apostles would do these same miracles. And I know there's some people that are continualists. They believe that this stuff can still happen today. I'm personally a sensationalist. I believe that these signs were used, these miracles were used prior to the completion of the canon of Scripture. And a lot of the people, when you study them, that claim to be working these miracles today, their doctrine and their theology is garbage. That they are false teachers by what they teach. God ain't going to use somebody mightily as a false teacher. But I want to look at Acts chapter 20, verse 5. We'll be coming in for a landing here just a moment. Acts 20, verse 5 through 12. It says, "These men going ahead waited for us at Troas, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of the unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together, and in the window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. And he was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. But Paul went and fell on him, and embracing him said, 'Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him.' Now when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till daybreak, he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted." So we see the Apostle Paul raises Eutychus here in Acts chapter 20. And a very interesting story. This man fell down a 3rd story. And they didn't have trauma care the way that we have trauma care today. And even today, some people are not going to survive a 3rd story fall. But that's going to wrap up this study for today. And we'll see you again on Saturday. No topical Saturday for the next couple weeks. We're going to come in and get through the rest of our study in 1 Kings through next week. But we're going to be in chapter 18 on Saturday. So I hope you have a great rest of your week. God bless, and we'll see you this weekend.